Hi, thank you for joining my talk today. My name is Jonathan Brown. I belong to the Faculty of Social Sciences at Hosei University, where I teach a variety of English classes and writing courses. Today I want to talk to you about contrastive rhetoric and defend it from some of its critics. So just real quick, for those of you who might not be familiar with contrastive rhetoric, it's quite an old concept in applied linguistics. Robert Kaplan basically initiated the idea in his 1966 study, Cultural Thought Patterns in Intercultural Education, in which he investigated the rhetorical patterns of different languages and compared them with what he defined as the linear rhetorical pattern of English. It was quite extensive, 600 essays, a variety of languages, and he divided these languages into 4 different rhetorical groups and compared those with the English linear pattern: Semitic, Oriental, Romance, and Russian. And he looked at how they differ from English. And he was actually the first to explore L1 cultural identity in writing. And so it was quite a breakthrough study. And he postulated that basically our cultural thought patterns influence how we organize our thoughts in writing. And that can be viewed or seen in the patterns of writing, the rhetorical patterns of the text of the writer. So, unsurprisingly, though, that this has come under a lot of criticism, and I want to talk a little bit about the criticism, but before I do, I want to talk about some of the contributions it has made. So despite its criticisms, it actually has contributed quite a bit to our field. Of course, to L2 writing, to the teaching of L2 writing. And this can be seen, as Silva claims, this can be seen in the type of textbooks we use, the very discipline-oriented approach. Very structured thesis, introduction and thesis, body that goes back to the thesis. In fact, I have a writing textbook that I use, and it actually has the line down the essay showing how English is linear. So this has certainly this has influenced the way we teach writing in the L2 writing classroom. But beyond that, it actually has had some interesting effects in a broader way. Not just to the L2 writing classroom specifically, but also to opening up the field to and making scholars aware and interested in rhetorical frameworks outside of the Anglo-Saxon sphere, specifically outside of English, but looking at more minority languages, or at least languages that had not been investigated very much by Western scholars. A few examples of such works is Oliver's well-known book in which he investigates Chinese and Indian communication. Smith looked at African rhetoric and tried to actually create a definition of African rhetoric by using African philosophy, just like the West adopts Aristotle philosophy and brought about the notion of what we consider as rhetorical patterns in English. Hatim looked at Arabic rhetoric, specifically argumentation, patterns used in argumentative writing. And Cole adopted Native American rhetoric actually in his writing classroom to introduce students to other types of rhetoric outside of English. And he explored what impact that had on his students' writing. So, but these all came after Copland, and it can be argued that Copland kind of opened the floodgates and made people interested in this, wanting to know more about it, because he's the one that shined a light on the fact that different cultures have different rhetorical frameworks. That being said, so despite his contributions, many people have still criticized, and the criticisms can be understandable. The first one is that it just simply that it oversimplifies languages and cultures. As Kubota states, writing involves a multiplicity of rhetorical forms and dynamic styles, and even so, it functions within purposeful rhetorical conventions. So even though it's quite complicated, writing's quite complicated, it still works within specific conventions. It has its restraints, right? Rhetorical conventions, it's restrained by educational policies, as well as even politics. And things are changing with writing as our world globalizes. And I mean, you can see that in Japanese writing has adopted different forms of rhetoric, perhaps more aligning with what you would expect of English rhetoric. But that's for another topic. But the idea is basically that you can't just say this is what writing is, this is what it looks like. It's dynamic. It changes over time. And so Copland saying English writing is straight, Arabic writing zigzags, Oriental writing, Asian writing goes in a circle like this. She said that's too simple. It's too convenient. Another criticism, and these are the two criticisms specifically that I want to address, because I acknowledge that the first one oversimplifies languages and cultures. There's some merit to that, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. But these other two, I think, take contrastive rhetoric into a direction it was never meant to go. One, that it overemphasizes cognitive factors at the expense of sociocultural factors. And two, that it ignores writers' unique individual identity in favor of generalized large cultural identity. So these are two major criticisms that have come up in the literature, and scholars have attempted to address these criticisms by reimagining contrastive rhetoric, by adapting these notions of sociocultural factors and individual identity into their own reimagined form of contrastive rhetoric. So one of the most well-known ones is Conor, and she calls her reimagined form intercultural rhetoric rather than contrastive rhetoric. And what she does is she takes the criticism, the idea of the sociocultural factors, and she incorporates that into her idea of intercultural rhetoric. That these things have to be taken into consideration, that there are other factors outside of just culture. There's social interaction, context that influence rhetoric. But she goes a little step further, and the reason she calls it intercultural rhetoric is because she says there's an accommodation that occurs between the L2 speaker and the L1 speaker. So the L1 speaker has to accommodate the L2 speaker to a certain degree when they are writing in their second language. The L1 speaker has to acknowledge that the writer is writing in their second language. And the L2 speaker has to accommodate the L1 speaker and realize that they are not going to be able to explain or get their point across or effectively communicate in the same way they would with another with a speaker of their same language. And so there is this accommodation that occurs, and it's not an assimilation, which is very key to intercultural communication. We don't assimilate. Non-native speakers don't assimilate in an intercultural communicative interaction. There's an accommodation that occurs, and she argues that that is what occurs in or should occur in her intercultural rhetoric. Kubota and Lehner also came up with their own reimagined form, critical contrastive rhetoric. And what they do is they reconceptualize the cultural difference in rhetoric by taking into account the variety of language and culture as for the uniqueness of individual identity, as well as for the uniqueness of individual identity. So they adopt these notions that within culture there's many varieties, right? So there's these small cultures, subcultures within the major cultures, and these have just as much, if not more, influence on the rhetoric than the larger culture. But they also acknowledge that then within these subcultures, each writer is an individual with their own identity, with their own way of writing, with their own rhetoric. And so they argue that these things have to be taken into consideration. But the thing, as I mentioned earlier, these criticisms really take contrastive rhetoric far beyond what it ever was meant to be. Contrastive rhetoric is actually rather simple, and so please bear with me for a moment. Like a tangled thread, it's rather complicated to untangle it, but then you just have a simple thread. And that's kind of what I'm trying to do here. Everything has gotten tangled a little bit, and I want to kind of untangle it so it gets a bit complex in that effort. But once I hopefully I successfully do that for you, you will see that actually contrastive rhetoric is actually a very simple thread. It's not as complicated as these criticisms have made it out to be. And to do this, I want to turn to a well-known, well-regarded, well-accepted theory in communication called common ground theory, established by Herbert Clark. And basically, what common ground theory says is that the shared knowledge, beliefs, and assumptions that are these things, the knowledge that you and I share, the beliefs that you and I share, the assumptions that you and I share, it is these things that help us create a successful communicative interaction. So these assumptions that we bring to a communicative interaction with another participant, these things are dependent on what Herbert calls as mutualities, things that are shared. And as a result, these assumptions then affect our choices in that communicative interaction. So keeping that in mind, the mutualities, everything that we share, this is what's important, the common ground. That's where the concept of common ground. We have to find common ground in order to successfully communicate with one another, really. And this is done. Discovering our common ground, negotiating our common ground is done through what Herbert Clark calls coordination devices. And these are precedents and these are conventions. The precedents, they help us to inform the participants. They inform the participants, help us inform us of our choices, of what choices we should make, depending on the context. The conventions, these things are acquired over a longer period of time. And they are acquired through consistent and constant interaction within a specific discourse community. And by being part of that discourse community, we learn, we acquire the conventions, both consciously as well as subconsciously. And without those conventions, it's very difficult for us to be a part of that discourse community. So, this is where the idea of common ground, the mutualities, or called commonalities of thought. The commonalities we share are the precedents and the conventions. And so, think about this. So Clark said that the sum of a speaker's mutual knowledge, beliefs, and suppositions, of participants' mutual knowledge, beliefs, and suppositions, this brings about a common ground. But if the sum does not add up, if there is not a mutual knowledge, beliefs, and suppositions, or they don't align with one another enough, then we don't have an equal equation, or our backgrounds, our knowledge, our commonalities, my precedents, my conventions don't converge with yours to create a common ground. And that's what we need. We need that. We need my conventions, my precedents, and yours to converge. And it's at that point where they meet that we've discovered common ground. Now maybe you're seeing where I'm going with this. This is obviously much more difficult for an L1 and L2 speaker to achieve. So these lack of mutualities between an L1 and L2 speaker means that common ground has to be negotiated more. This is often what can be called as emergent common ground. It emerges through negotiation, through clarification, through asking each other questions, and signaling to one another when there's a misunderstanding or confusion. But as you can see, this is not something that can be done very well through written discourse. The reader cannot signal to the writer that they do not understand. The writer cannot backtrack and go off on a tangent to explain an idea or give some background information and come back to the point easily in writing. And so that is why in writing, the precedents and the conventions are so vital to make to make a text to appear logical and to be easily understood by another reader. So CR Contrastive Rhetoric shows how the choices made and the assumptions had by the L2 writer, they don't mesh with the expectations and assumptions of L1 speakers. And this results in a coordination problem, or what Kaplan would refer as something as an illogical text perceived by the L1 speaker. So this is where the coordination devices come into play with contrastive rhetoric. So this is what contrastive rhetoric really is about. It's just saying, look, the assumptions that the L2 writer has does not meet the assumptions and expectations of the L1 writer. As a result, since they do not meet, they cannot form a common ground, and therefore there's misunderstanding. The L1 speaker perceives the text as illogical. I'm not going to say that the text is illogical. Perhaps that's a mistake that Kaplan made by saying that, by implying that rhetorical forms outside of English are illogical. That's not the case. but they can be perceived as illogical if they don't follow that speaker's expectation of what logic is. So contrastive rhetoric is about helping the L2 learner. This is really what it's about. It's helping the L2 learners become more effective writers in the target language. So, for example, Japanese writers learning English, helping them to become more effective writers in English by introducing the precedent that they need to be familiar with, bringing that to the forefront, and identifying the conventions that are shared in English. So English shares these conventions. This is the precedent you need to know about in order to successfully communicate when you enter that specific discourse community being the very broad English community, right? So, commonalities of thought in contrastive rhetoric continuing. So, contrastive rhetoric seeks to expose these commonalities of thought that are taken for granted. So, this is what Herbert Clark said, is that commonalities of thought are taken for granted in specific discourse communities. And this is why it can be very hard for native English speaker writers, teachers, to effectively teach English writing to non-native speakers, because there's some unspoken values, some unspoken conventions that we take for granted, that we because they've not been uttered, they've not been explicated, they've never been taught to us explicitly, we might not be entirely aware of them. We take them for granted. And so that's really what contrastive rhetoric is trying to do for the teacher. Say, look, here are some commonalities of thought in writing that you are taking for granted, that your students might not be familiar with, that you need to expose them to, that you need to explicate. So Copland even argues this in his paper. And so really you can see that these criticisms really took contrastive rhetoric far away from what it was really about. Contrastive rhetoric was actually a very simple idea. It was that students are making mistakes in their writing. So when native speakers read their writing, they feel that it is not logical. Why is that? What are they doing that is making native English speakers feel that it's not logical? In other words, what things are not being taught that need to be taught? So, as Copland states, this discussion, the discussion of contrastive rhetoric, is not intended to offer any criticism of other existing paragraph developments. Rather, it is intended only to demonstrate that paragraph developments, other than those normally regarded as desirable in English, do exist. So, he acknowledges that there are other types of forms that exist outside of English. So, we have a certain expectation, we have precedents, we have conventions, but there are other languages that have their own. This is what he's saying. And the teacher must himself be aware of these differences. So we have to be aware, as teachers, we have to be aware that these differences exist, and therefore make these differences overtly apparent to our students. That's all it was about. That's all contrastive rhetoric was about. So again, it's just a pedagogical concept. Really, it's just about the classroom, about teaching. It wasn't trying to be philosophical. It wasn't trying to go into these notions of one culture is superior over another. I mean, this is another criticism I didn't go into, but I mean, some have said that it has pushed the notion of linguistic imperialism, has tried to push English as superior to other languages. And Copland did that unintentionally by comparing other languages to English. In other words, English is at the top, and it's the language by which all other languages should be compared, should be measured. Perhaps by doing that, by his study comparing it to English, it gave that impression to some. But Copland himself, in that very paper, said that's not what he was trying to do. again, you can see that it's actually quite simple. It's just about investigating. It's an investigation of commonalities across various cultural contexts in an effort to help writers find common ground with their readers. And again, going back to the idea that it's trying to make English into some superior language, Copland never argued specifically that this is all about English. He used English in his specific study to compare, but that wasn't actually the purpose. Actually, there's been other studies that have compared other languages to different non-English languages. And he kind of opened the door to that idea. So, again, these things have kind of gone beyond what Contrastive Rhetoric is really about. And I'm sorry I've gone a little over time. So just to quickly conclude, Contrastive Rhetoric, let's keep it simple. Let's not go off into a tangent. Let's not go discuss these ideas of sociocultural factors, of individual identity, so forth. Let's bring it back to something much more simple, simplistic, by viewing it through common ground perspective. And by doing that, we kind of bring it back to its original purpose, that it's just about exposing, by teaching students things they need to know in order to reach common ground with their with the L1 native readers. So as we can see that this attempt to redefine or reimagine contrastive rhetoric really is not necessary, and it's much better to just view it in the simple way, and by doing so, we see its true intended purpose to help L2 learners reach a common ground with L1 speakers. Thank you very much, and I hope you enjoyed your talk, and if you have any questions, I'll be online. Bye.